and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. When I was around 12 or 13 years old, I stayed up late one weekend with two of my sisters. I have 5 siblings, so our house was usually busy and noisy. It was either a Friday or Saturday night, which meant none of us were worried about getting up early for school the next morning. At first, the evening felt normal. My sisters and I were talking, watching television, and enjoying the extra freedom of being allowed to stay awake. My older brother was stretched out on the couch and had fallen into a deep sleep. My father was still finishing some work before bed. The only thing that felt unusual was my mother. At some point that evening, we noticed she had been crying. She tried to hide it, but it was obvious something had upset her. My sisters and I asked what was wrong. She would not explain. She only said, "This day holds bad memories." That answer made us curious, but we could tell she did not want to talk about it. We assumed it was connected to something private from her past. Maybe someone had died on that date. Maybe something had happened in the family that she did not want to discuss with children. We stopped asking. The words stayed in the back of my mind, though. This day holds bad memories. At the time, I did not understand what she meant. Later, those words would become one of the most disturbing parts of the night. Around 11 o'clock, my father began getting ready for bed. He was putting away his work and checking that everything in the house was secure. Then we heard noises coming from the garage. It sounded as though someone was moving things. There were faint scrapes, taps, and heavier sounds from behind the door. The noises were not constant, but they were clear enough that several of us noticed them. Our first thought was my older brother. He often worked on projects in the garage. He liked taking things apart, building things, and tinkering with tools. It would not have been unusual for him to be out there late, searching for something or finishing an idea. Then we looked toward the couch. He was asleep. He was not pretending to rest or lying there with his eyes partly open. He was completely out. That left the possibility of an animal. Raccoons sometimes entered garages, sheds, and bins looking for food. They could knock over containers or drag objects around. A raccoon trapped inside would make exactly the kind of sounds we were hearing. My father decided to investigate. Because we did not know whether the noise came from an animal or a person, he took a shotgun with him. One of my sisters grabbed a baseball bat. I took a broom. Looking back, the broom would not have offered much protection against a burglar or angry raccoon, but it was the closest thing I could find. The 3 of us approached the garage door. My father opened it first. The garage was completely dark. For a second, we stood at the entrance, listening. The noises had stopped. My father reached for the switch and turned on the light. The room appeared empty. The family car was parked inside. My older brother's projects were spread across the work area, along with tools, parts, boxes, and other things collected over time. Nothing immediately looked disturbed. There was no raccoon hiding beside the bins. No person stood behind the car. No tools were rolling across the floor. My father searched carefully. He looked around the sides of the vehicle and checked the darker corners. We searched behind containers and anywhere a small animal might hide. We did not find anything. The garage door was closed, and there was no obvious sign that an animal had forced its way inside. My father probably decided that the sounds came from objects settling or something shifting naturally. Garages are full of metal, wood, and tools that react to temperature changes. A loose object can slide after sitting still for hours. Something resting against a wall can fall without warning. A small animal may also enter and escape through an opening too narrow for us to notice. After several minutes, my father returned inside. He had work to finish and did not believe there was any danger. My sister and I stayed behind. She had become interested in some of our older brother's projects. Since the lights were on and our father had searched the room, the garage no longer felt dangerous. I began explaining some of the things our brother was working on. I do not remember exactly what the projects were. There may have been mechanical parts, electronics, or pieces of equipment arranged near the workbench. My sister looked over them with mild interest while I told her what I understood. For a short time, everything was normal again. Then I felt as though someone was watching me. The feeling came suddenly. There was no new sound and no voice from behind us. I simply became aware of a presence in the garage. The back of my neck tightened, and I felt an urgent need to turn around. At almost the exact same moment, my sister spun around too. Neither of us told the other to look. We both moved instinctively, raising the objects we were holding. She still had the bat. I held the broom in front of me. We faced the area in front of the parked car. A dark figure was there. I could not see a face, clothes, or any normal details. It appeared only as a silhouette. The shape looked roughly human, but something about its position was wrong. It did not seem to be standing on the floor. It looked as though it was floating slightly above the ground or hanging from something we could not see. The body seemed long and still. It did not wave, step forward, or speak. It only faced us. The garage light was on, so it should have been possible to see more. There should have been color, shadows, or some visible surface reflecting the light. Instead, the figure looked unnaturally dark. It was darker than the wall and the objects around it, like a person's shaped section of shadow placed into a bright room. My sister saw it too. That was clear from the way she reacted. She did not ask what I was looking at. She stared directly toward the same place, holding the bat as though she expected the figure to move. For a second, neither of us spoke. The figure remained in front of the car. The longer I looked, the more its strange position disturbed me. It was too high to be standing normally. Its feet did not appear planted on the floor. The body looked suspended. Then my sister screamed. The instant she did, the silhouette vanished. I did not see it walk away. It did not move behind the car or fade slowly. One moment, the shape was there. The next, the space in front of the car was empty. My sister's scream brought everyone running. My father came back with my mother, and my older brother woke on the couch and rushed into the garage. We tried to explain what we had seen. We told them that a dark figure had been standing or hanging in front of the car. We said it disappeared when my sister screamed. The adults looked around again. There was nobody inside. No intruder was hiding behind the vehicle. Nothing hung from the ceiling. There was no object in front of the car that obviously resembled a person. My parents told us we had probably seen a reflection on one of the car windows. That explanation was reasonable. The garage contained several light sources and reflective surfaces. A person moving near the doorway could create a dark shape on the car. The windows might reflect one of us, a hanging coat, a tool, or something outside the room. If my sister and I moved at the same time, the reflection could disappear instantly. The shape may have seemed suspended because it was visible on glass rather than standing on the floor. At our age, Fear and expectation could easily turn a reflection into a human figure. We had already heard unexplained sounds. We had entered carrying weapons. Our bodies were prepared to see a threat. When I suddenly turned, my sister may have copied me. We could both have focused on the same reflection and interpreted it as a person. Then, when she screamed and moved, the angle changed and the image vanished. That may be exactly what happened. But I remember the figure as being in front of the car, not only on the window. It seemed to occupy the room. It had depth. I could see the shape of a body hanging in the open space. My sister remembered it the same way. We did not argue with our parents for long. There was nothing left to show them. The figure was gone, and the garage looked completely normal. Eventually, everyone returned inside. The night continued, but I did not forget what I had seen. For years, I treated the event as a strange childhood experience. It was frightening, but nothing else happened afterward that I could clearly connect to it. We did not repeatedly see the figure in the garage. No one found signs of a person living inside the house. There were no ropes hanging from the ceiling and no footprints around the car. The noises that brought us into the garage could have been ordinary. The silhouette could have been a reflection. That was the explanation I tried to accept. Then, years later, my sister and I learned why our mother had been crying that night. The date held bad memories because it was the anniversary of our great-uncle's death. More than 40 years earlier, he had taken his own life by hanging himself. The family had not spoken openly about it when we were children. Our mother knew the date, and every year it brought back the memory. That alone explained her sadness. What disturbed us was the location. Our great-uncle had died in the same place where we saw the hanging silhouette. The area in front of the car was where his body had been found. I remember the physical chill that came over me when I understood the connection. Until then, the figure had been only a dark shape. Once we learned the family history, its position made terrible sense. It had looked as though it was floating or hanging, because that was what had happened there decades before. My sister and I had not known. Our mother never told us before that night. No one had described how our great-uncle died or shown us the exact place. We were too young, and the subject was painful. That meant the image had not come from a story planted in our minds. At least, that is how it seemed. We had seen a suspended figure in the same spot without knowing the history. The coincidence felt too precise. I began replaying the entire evening, my mother crying, her refusal to explain. This day holds bad memories. The noises from the garage around 11, my sleeping brother, the empty search, the feeling of being watched. My sister and I turning at the same time, the black silhouette hanging in front of the car. Then the scream and disappearance. The events suddenly formed a single story. Perhaps the anniversary brought something back. Maybe the noises were the first sign. Perhaps the figure appeared because two children had entered the exact place where a family member died. That was the supernatural explanation, and for a long time, it frightened me. But learning the history may also have changed the memory. Before we knew about our great-uncle, we described the figure as floating or hanging from something. After learning how he died, that part became more important. The connection may have sharpened details that were originally uncertain. Memory is not a recording. Every time we remember an event, we rebuild it. New information can enter the old image without us realizing it. A shadow that looked slightly above the floor might later become a clearly hanging body, because that interpretation now fits. The figure may also have been a reflection from the car. The shape of one of us, distorted across curved glass, could appear long and suspended. The garage light might cast shadows from tools or objects hanging overhead. If something swung slightly when the door opened, Both of us could see it move and feel watched. When my sister screamed, one of us shifted, causing the shadow to disappear. Shared misinterpretation remains possible. My sister and I were looking from nearly the same place. We were both frightened by the noises and carrying objects for protection. If the garage contained a human-shaped reflection, both of us would see it. The feeling of being watched may have come from a small sound behind us. I turned first, and she reacted to my movement so quickly that it felt simultaneous. Or she may have turned first, causing me to do the same. Over time, we remembered ourselves spinning together because that made the event feel more powerful. There is no way to test the exact timing now. The figure may even have been our older brother. He had been asleep on the couch when we first checked, but he could have awakened and entered quietly. The garage door connecting to the house may have allowed him to stand near the car and frighten us. When my sister screamed, he could have ducked or moved behind the vehicle. However, he came running with our parents afterward and appeared confused. He never admitted to a prank. There also did not seem to be enough time for him to move from the garage, return to the house, and arrive with everyone without being noticed. One of our parents could have cast a shadow from the doorway while checking on us, but they had gone back inside and only returned after the scream. A reflection from outside is another possibility. Headlights from a passing car could project a human-shaped shadow through a window. A tree branch, post, or object outside might appear across the garage wall or vehicle. As the car passed, the image would vanish suddenly. The noises and our fear made us interpret the moving shadow as a person. That would explain why it appeared only briefly and left no physical evidence. Yet the figure did not seem to move across the room like headlights. It remained still long enough for both of us to stare. It faced us. It seemed aware. That feeling may have come from the shape having something like a head. Human brains are extremely sensitive to faces and bodies. We see people in coats, curtains, shadows, and furniture, because identifying another person quickly is important for survival. A vague oval above a dark vertical form becomes a head and torso. Once the pattern is recognized, the figure seems to look directly at us. The car itself could have produced the whole image. The windshield, mirrors, doors, and hanging seat belts create shapes that change depending on the angle. A dark reflection of the open doorway might look like a tall body. The bumper or lower frame could hide the bottom, creating the impression that it floated. This remains the most reasonable explanation. But the exact location of our great-uncle's death prevents the memory from feeling ordinary. If we had seen the shadow anywhere else in the garage, the connection would be weaker. Instead, it appeared where his body had been found. It happened on the anniversary. Our mother was already crying about him. The timing and place matched without our knowledge. Coincidences can be extremely specific. A year contains only 365 days, and families often experience strong memories on anniversaries. The garage was a likely place for reflections because of the car and lighting. The area in front of the car was open, making any shadow there visible. Our great-uncle may also have died there because it was an open part of the structure. The same physical layout that made it possible for him to hang himself may have made it a natural location for a floating-looking reflection. The connection could arise from the room rather than anything supernatural. That explanation is logical. Emotionally, it is not always enough. I often wonder what my mother experienced that evening before the noises began. Was she only remembering the date, or had something else happened earlier? Did she hear sounds in the garage, too? Did she feel that the house was different? She may have been crying because the anniversary always affected her, with no connection to our sighting. We never asked for every detail. The subject was painful, and none of us wanted to make her relive it only to satisfy our curiosity. I also do not know whether our great uncle died in the current garage or an earlier version of the structure. Houses change over 40 years. Walls are rebuilt. Cars are parked in different places. The exact spot may have been remembered generally rather than measured precisely. A relative might have said, he was found in front of where the car is now, and the family repeated it. That could make the connection seem more exact than it was. Even so, the garage was the location. That alone was enough. I try not to describe the figure as my great uncle. We never saw a face. There were no recognizable clothes or features. It did not speak. We only saw a silhouette shaped like someone hanging or floating. Calling it a ghost would add certainty we do not have. It could have been light and shadow. It could have been an object we failed to identify. It could have been fear creating a person from reflections. But if anything connected to my great uncle remained there, I do not believe it tried to harm us. The figure did not approach. It did not chase us or touch anyone. It appeared in the place where he died and vanished when my sister screamed. Perhaps the sighting was only a brief replay of something that had happened long before, with no awareness of us. Some people believe traumatic events leave impressions on places. They describe it less like a conscious spirit and more like a recording that occasionally repeats under the right conditions. A sound, image, or movement appears without communicating. The same scene plays and then ends. There is no scientific proof that buildings store memories in that way, but the idea fits what we experienced better than an intelligent ghost. The silhouette did not seem to ask for anything. It only occupied the same space. The date may have acted as a trigger, or our mother's grief may have made the family more sensitive to the history. Again, these are only ideas. I remain aware that two frightened children in a garage can misread a reflection. That explanation does not disrespect our great uncle or deny the seriousness of his death. It simply recognizes how darkness, light, and fear affect perception. The garage was not completely dark, but bright overhead lights can create deep shadows around vehicles. A person-shaped reflection on glass may look black because the background behind it is much brighter. The figure appearing to hang could come from the upper part being visible while the lower part blended into the car. The screen caused movement, changing the angle and removing the image. It is a complete natural explanation. The sounds earlier may have been tools settling. Nothing supernatural is required. But when I return to the memory, I do not first think about light angles or curved glass. I remember the feeling before I turned. I remember knowing someone was watching. I remember my sister spinning at the same moment. I remember us raising the bat and broom toward the front of the car. The dark shape was already facing us. It seemed suspended in the light. My sister screamed. The space became empty. Then, years later, we learned that someone in our family had died there by hanging on that exact date. I think my mother had tried to protect us by not explaining why she was crying. She did not want young children carrying the weight of a suicide that happened decades before we were born. None of us could have guessed how closely the night would connect itself to that history. The saddest part is that our great uncle became known to us mainly through the manner of his death. I know very little about who he was while alive. I do not know what made him laugh, what kind of work he did, or what he wanted from life. The family remembered the date because of tragedy. The garage remembered him, if that is what happened, only as a hanging shape. I do not like reducing a person to that final act. Whatever we saw, I hope it was not him trapped in the moment of his death. I would rather believe it was a reflection. At least then, his suffering ended 40 years earlier, and the figure belonged only to light, fear, and coincidence. Yet there are nights when the ordinary explanation feels incomplete. the timing returns. My mother's tears. The noises that drew us into the garage. The empty first search. My father leaving. My sister and me remaining behind without knowing the history. Then, both of us turning. It is difficult not to wonder whether something wanted the location to be noticed. We never saw it again. The garage returned to normal. My older brother continued working on his projects. The car remained parked in the same place. No hanging shadow appeared during later anniversaries, at least not while I was there. That lack of repetition supports the reflection explanation. If the figure were a ghost connected to the date, it might return each year. But strange experiences do not follow rules people contest. A single event offers no pattern. It remains a memory suspended between what we saw and what we later learned. I was 12 or 13. My sister was beside me. We both saw the same dark form. Our fear was real. The family history was real. Whether the figure was connected to that history is the part I cannot prove. I only know that my mother began the night by saying the date held bad memories. At 11, noises came from the garage. My sister and I found no animal or person. Then, while we stood talking beside our brother's projects, we felt watched. We turned toward the car. A human-shaped silhouette hung in the place in front of it. It remained there until my sister screamed. Then, it was gone. Years later, we learned our great-uncle had died by hanging himself more than 40 years before. It happened on the same date. And the place where his body was found was exactly where the shadow had been waiting. I was around 7 or 8 years old when this happened, and at the time I did not fully understand how strange it was. My parents had gone out for the night on some kind of date. They left my 2 older siblings and me at home together. I do not remember whether one of them was officially supposed to be babysitting me, but both of them were old enough that my parents trusted us to remain in the house for a few hours. By around 11 that night, my brother and sister had both gone to their rooms. They were probably listening to music, reading, or doing whatever they normally did when they wanted privacy. I was still awake in one of the living rooms, even though it was long past the time I was supposed to be in bed. The house was mostly dark. A television or small lamp may have been on near me, but the hallway and the other living room were unlit. At that age, I was used to the house and did not feel completely afraid of walking through it at night. It was home. I knew where the furniture was and which floorboards made noise. I knew the difference between the refrigerator starting up and someone moving in another room. There were 3 landline telephones in the house. 2 of them were black. Each black phone was kept in one of the living rooms. They were connected to our normal home number, so whenever someone called, both of those phones rang together. The 3rd phone was different. It was gray and sat in the garage beside a dim lamp. It was plugged into one of the telephone wall connections, but it did not seem to be attached to the same line as the other 2 phones. When someone called our house, the 2 black phones rang. The gray one did not. My parents never explained why it was there. They never said it had its own number, and I never saw anyone use it. It was not treated like an important emergency phone or a private line for one of the adults. It simply remained in the garage, plugged in and waiting. As a child, I accepted that without questioning it. Adults kept strange objects everywhere. The garage was full of tools, old boxes, wires, and equipment that nobody explained to me. The gray phone was only another forgotten thing. That night, while I was sitting alone in the living room, a telephone began ringing. At first, I assumed it was one of the black phones. The sound was familiar, but something about it seemed wrong. It was quieter and more distant than it should have been. Instead of coming from the living room, It seemed to be traveling through the walls from farther away. I stopped whatever I was doing and listened. The phone rang again. The sound came from the direction of the garage. I remember walking out into the dark living room and trying to locate it. For a moment, I thought someone might have moved one of the black phones. Maybe a handset had been left in the garage, or perhaps I was simply confused by the way the ringing echoed through the house. Landline phones were loud, and sound could travel strangely at night. But the black phone in the living room was not ringing. It remained silent in its normal place. The distant ringing continued. I walked toward the garage. The closer I got, the clearer it became. The gray phone was ringing. I opened the garage door and looked inside. The small lamp near the phone was on, but it did not light the whole room. It created a weak yellow glow around the table or shelf where the telephone sat, leaving the rest of the garage in shadow. The large door was closed. The corners beyond the lamp were dark. The gray phone continued ringing beside the light. Even then, I did not understand that I should be frightened. I was confused more than anything else. A phone was ringing, and when a phone rang, you answered it. That was the rule I understood. I stepped into the garage and walked toward it. The ringing sounded louder in the enclosed space. I picked up the receiver and held it to my ear. I probably said hello. No one answered. There was only breathing on the other end. It was not the crackling or empty hiss of a disconnected line. Someone seemed to be there. I could hear slow breaths passing through the receiver. The person did not say my name. They did not ask for my parents. They did not explain who they were or why they had called. They only breathed. At 7 or 8 years old, I did not immediately recognize how threatening that was. I may have thought the caller had poor reception or was too far from the phone to speak. Perhaps I believed someone had called accidentally. I waited for a short time, still listening. The breathing continued. Then, I hung up. I placed the receiver back on the phone and left the garage. I did not run. I did not wake my siblings or call my parents. I returned to whatever I had been doing as though nothing important had happened. Only later, when I was older, did I understand how disturbing the situation was. The gray phone was not supposed to ring. It did not ring when people called our normal home number. As far as I knew, no one in the family had ever given out a separate number connected to it. Yet someone reached that phone at 11 at night. When I answered, they remained silent and listened while breathing into the line. The ordinary explanation is that the gray phone did have a separate number. My parents may have known about it and simply never discussed it with us. It could have been an old business line, a second household number, or a connection left by someone who lived in the house before us. At the time, many homes had multiple telephone lines. One might be used for a fax machine, dial-up internet, home office, alarm system, or teenager's private number. The gray phone may have been plugged into a line that was rarely used, but still active. My parents might not have considered it important enough to explain to a child. If that was the case, the call itself may have been random. Someone dialed the wrong number and did not speak after realizing a child had answered. A prank caller could have selected numbers at random and breathed into the phone to frighten whoever picked up. Silent and obscene phone calls were more common before caller identification became standard. The caller may have expected an adult. When they heard a young voice, they remained silent. That possibility is unpleasant, but completely human. The line might also have crossed with another one. Older telephone systems could behave unpredictably. Damaged wiring, moisture, or incorrect connections sometimes allowed people to hear calls intended for another home. The gray phone may have rung because of an electrical fault or crossed line. When I picked it up, the breathing could have belonged to someone using another telephone without knowing I was listening. Perhaps they had answered their own call and were waiting for the other person to speak. Neither of us understood how we had been connected. A crossed line would explain why the caller said nothing and why the number was not known to our family. The breathing may not have been directed at me at all. It could even have been feedback or line noise that sounded like a person. Telephone receivers amplify very small sounds. Static can rise and fall in a rhythm resembling breath. An open line may carry air movement, distant movement, or electrical pulses. A child listening in a dark garage might interpret those sounds as someone breathing. That is possible. But I remember it as human. There was an inhale, then an exhale, a pause, then another breath. The sound had weight and closeness, as though the person held the receiver directly beside their mouth. If the call was a prank, the caller may have known the number belonged to the garage line. Perhaps it was a former resident. Someone who had lived in the house earlier could still remember the old number. They might have called out of curiosity and remained silent when a child answered. If the line had once belonged to a workshop or business, the number could still exist in an old directory. A caller might have expected to reach someone who no longer lived there. The strange breathing could have been surprise, confusion, or hesitation. Maybe the person eventually realized they had the wrong number, but chose not to explain. The phone's location raises another question. Why was an active line kept in the garage? The dim lamp made the phone look almost deliberately placed. It was not stored in a box or left disconnected on a shelf. It sat near a light with access to the wall connection. Someone had intended it to be usable. Perhaps my father used it while working in the garage and simply never received calls there during the day. Maybe it connected to a private line that only rang when a specific person called. The night I answered may have been the first time I happened to be awake when it rang. My parents might have known exactly who called, but never learned about it because I failed to tell them. That thought bothers me. The caller may have been someone familiar to them. Perhaps they called regularly after the children went to bed, expecting one of my parents to answer. When they heard my young voice, they stayed quiet to avoid revealing themselves. That would turn the phone from a forgotten object into something private. There is no evidence for that. But children often know less about their parents' lives than they realize. The separate line could have been used for work, family matters, or something my parents did not discuss with us. The caller's silence may have protected a secret rather than signaled danger. Still, breathing into the phone without speaking is a strange response to a child. A normal wrong number caller would usually apologize and hang up. Someone reaching a business line would ask for a person. A family friend would recognize that a child had answered and say something. This caller chose to remain there. They listened while I listened. I do not remember which of us disconnected first. I believe I hung up because the silence became boring or confusing. If the caller had remained connected until I replaced the receiver, that would suggest they wanted to keep me on the line. At my age, I did not ask questions. Who is this? Why are you calling? How did you get this number? I may have said hello only once and accepted the lack of reply. The fact that I reacted so calmly is one of the most unsettling parts when I remember it now. Children do not always recognize danger because they have not learned which details are abnormal. I understood that strangers at the door could be dangerous. I knew not to leave the house alone at night. But a telephone felt safe. The person was far away. They could not reach through the receiver. I did not consider the possibility that they might know where we lived. Landline numbers were connected to physical addresses. If the caller deliberately dialed that line, they may have known the exact house containing the gray phone. They may also have known it was in the garage. Perhaps they had installed it or used it years earlier. That creates a much darker possibility. Someone outside the house might have been watching. They could see that the garage lamp was on or notice movement through a window. Then they called the line and waited to see who answered. The breathing would not come from a stranger far away. It could come from someone standing nearby. Maybe they wanted to confirm that the children were home alone. The timing, around 11 at night while my parents were away, would then be important. How would the caller know my parents had left? They might have watched the car leave. They could have seen the lights in my siblings' rooms and realized the adults were gone. If they knew the garage phone's number, the call would allow them to test whether anyone was awake. When a child answered, they learned the house was occupied, but not necessarily protected by an adult. There is no proof that happened. I did not see anyone outside. No one tried to open the garage. The doors remained closed, and nothing else happened that night. A person planning to enter might have acted after confirming the situation. They did not. That makes random or accidental contact more likely. But perhaps my answering scared them away. They expected no response or an adult voice. Hearing a child might have made the situation riskier. My siblings were also inside, and one of them could have called police. The caller may have decided not to approach. Another possibility is that one of my siblings was playing a prank. They could have found a way to call the garage line from another phone. If the gray phone had a separate number, someone in the house might know it. My brother or sister could dial from their room, breathe silently, and laugh after I hung up. But the black landlines may not have been able to call another number while sharing the same household connection, depending on the telephone setup. A mobile phone could do it, but I do not remember whether either sibling had one then. They also never admitted to a prank. If they knew I had gone into the dark garage alone, they probably would have tried to frighten me more openly. Children and teenagers rarely maintain a secret joke for years, when revealing it would be funnier. Then again, I never told them about the call at the time. They may not have known how I reacted. Perhaps one of them called, heard me answer, breathed for a few seconds, and assumed I understood it was a joke. The incident could have been meaningless to them and unforgettable only to me. I wish I had asked my parents about the phone while we still lived there. They could have explained why it existed and whether it had its own number. Maybe the answer would have been simple. It was an old line that had never been disconnected. It was connected to a neighbor by mistake. It belonged to a previous business. The phone itself may not even have been active. If it was plugged into a wall connection with no service, perhaps it could still ring because of electrical testing or voltage from another line. Telephone systems send a strong electrical signal to trigger the bell. Faulty wiring could cause a phone to ring even without an intentional incoming call. When I answered, the breathing sound might have been current or static. This is technically possible, though I do not know enough about the wiring to say how likely it is. The phone could also have been connected to an intercom or security system rather than an outside line. Some homes use telephone handsets as communication devices between rooms, gates, or nearby buildings. If someone activated the system accidentally, the garage phone might ring. The breathing could come from another handset somewhere in the house. Maybe one of my siblings picked up without speaking. The adults might not have explained the system because it was old and rarely used. Again, the physical setup would decide whether that explanation works, and I no longer remember enough. The garage itself contributed to the fear I developed later. At the time, it was only dim. Now, when I replay the memory, I picture the shadows beyond the lamp and imagine someone standing where I could not see. I had entered alone because the ringing drew me there. The phone sat in a small circle of light, like bait. I walked across the garage and lifted the receiver. While I listened to the breathing, I never checked the windows or the large door. I assumed the person existed only on the telephone line. What if the sound came from both the receiver and the room? What if someone stood in the darkness, breathing while I held the phone to my ear. That idea is almost certainly created by memory and fear. I would have heard breathing nearby. The lamp may have revealed movement. There was no attack or later evidence. But childhood memories become more frightening when adult understanding is added to them. As a child, I saw an unanswered call. As an adult, I see a child being summoned into an isolated part of the house at night. The ringing came from the one phone no one used. The caller did not speak. They waited while I stood near the garage door with my back to the dark room. The breathing itself may have been enough to hold me there. A caller does not need words to make someone listen. Silence creates expectation. Each breath suggests the person is about to say something. You wait for the explanation. That waiting gives them control over the conversation. I did not feel controlled then. I was only puzzled. But the caller heard my voice. They knew a young child had answered. They chose not to leave immediately. That is difficult to treat as completely harmless. Maybe the person had a medical condition or speech difficulty. Perhaps they were crying or struggling to breathe. They may have called the wrong number during an emergency, but been unable to speak. If so, hanging up could have ended someone's attempt to get help. That possibility has occurred to me too. A person experiencing a heart problem, panic attack, or injury might dial incorrectly and breathe heavily into the phone. They may not be capable of explaining themselves. The call could sound threatening, even though the caller was the one in danger. But the breathing I remember did not sound desperate. It sounded controlled. Slow, intentional, memory may have altered that impression. I was 7 or 8, and I did not remain on the line long enough to understand. Another possibility is that no person was there at all. Landline users sometimes heard their own breathing echoed back through the receiver. If the line had unusual feedback, I may have been listening to myself. I picked up the phone, became quiet, and heard air move near the mouthpiece. The system returned a delayed version through the earpiece, making it sound like someone else. I could have interpreted my own breath as a caller's. That would explain why the rhythm seemed calm and why no one spoke. When I held my breath to listen, the sound may have continued briefly because of delay or background noise. I do not remember testing it. A child would not think to move the receiver away, cover the mouthpiece, or compare the sound to their own breathing. Telephone echo is common enough that this may be one of the strongest explanations. The gray phone might have rung because of a crossed or faulty line, then reflected my own breathing once I answered. A completely ordinary electrical problem could create the entire experience. If that is true, the only mystery is why the phone rang at all. The line may have received a real call from a wrong number. The caller hung up immediately, but the connection remained noisy for a second. I picked up too late and heard only the open line. What I remember as ongoing breathing could have lasted only a few moments. The story grew more dramatic when I understood horror films and threatening phone calls later in life. That is possible. I do not want to pretend the memory is perfectly preserved. I remember the basic sequence more clearly than its duration. The phone rang. I entered the garage. I answered. There was breathing. I hung up. I did not react with fear until much later. That calm reaction may suggest the sound was less intense than I now imagine. If someone had breathed loudly and deliberately for a long time, even a child might feel afraid. Perhaps it was only faint line noise that sounded breath-like. My adult mind has given the caller sinister intention because silent breathing is a familiar horror image. Still, there is something deeply wrong about a phone ringing when no one knows its number. The gray phone was physically separate from the other two. It did not join them during normal calls. It seemed forgotten. Then, on a night when my parents were gone, it became active. That coincidence may be the only reason the event stayed with me. If it rang during the afternoon with adults nearby, someone would answer and explain it. At 11, the distant sound drew the youngest person in the house into the garage. No one else noticed. My siblings remained in their rooms. The caller reached only me. I sometimes wonder whether the phone ever rang again. Perhaps it did, and my parents answered without telling us. Maybe it rang regularly after I went to bed. The line may have been used for conversations the children were never meant to hear. Or perhaps that was the only call it ever received. A single event is difficult to investigate because there is no pattern. No second call allowed us to trace the number. No repeated breathing established a prank. No later break-in connected the caller to the house. The incident ended when I put the receiver down. The phone returned to being an unused gray object beside the lamp. That lack of continuation should make the experience less frightening. Instead, it makes it feel unfinished. There was never an answer. The person did not reveal who they were. My parents did not explain the line. I never learned whether anyone else heard the phone ring. I sometimes imagine asking my mother or father now, why did we have a separate phone in the garage? They might laugh and tell me it belonged to an old fax line or a previous owner. Maybe they would say it was connected to the same number and only failed to ring because the ringer had been switched off. The night I answered could have been a normal call that activated after the setting changed. If the phone was mechanically unreliable, it might ring only occasionally. The breathing could be a wrong number caller. A 30-second explanation could remove years of unease. But there is also the possibility that they would not remember the phone at all. That would make the memory feel even stranger. If no one intentionally placed it there, who connected it? Why was there a lamp beside it? Why did it remain ready to receive calls? The physical details may also be less mysterious than I recall. The lamp could have been kept near a workbench for ordinary garage tasks. The phone happened to sit beside it because that was where the wall jack was located. The line may have been completely normal. Childhood memory isolates objects and gives them significance after the fact. At the time, the garage contained dozens of ordinary things. Now I remember only the gray phone and the small pool of light around it. I do not believe the call was supernatural. Telephones require electrical connections and numbers. Someone or something in the system caused it to ring. The explanation is probably technical or human. A crossed line, a wrong number, a prank, an old separate account. Echoed breathing. One of those is likely. But an ordinary explanation does not necessarily make the event safe. A human caller who knew the hidden number might have had a reason for remaining silent. They may have known the house. They may have known my parents were away. Perhaps they were listening to determine who was inside. The fact that nothing happened afterward does not prove the call was innocent. Sometimes danger ends because a person changes their mind. Maybe hearing a child answer was enough. Maybe the caller realized I had siblings nearby. Maybe they expected the garage to be empty and became frightened when someone responded. I will never know. What I do know is how easily I followed the sound. I heard a phone ring from a dark, separate room. I walked toward it without telling anyone. I entered the garage alone. I picked up a telephone that was not connected to our normal line. On the other end, a person breathed into my ear. And because I was only 7 or 8 years old, I simply hung up and went back inside. It took years before I understood that the most frightening part was not the breathing. It was that whoever called had reached a phone no one in our family seemed to use. In a room away from the rest of the house, on a night when the adults were gone. When I was younger, my parents, my three siblings, and I all lived together in a three-bedroom house. Because there were four children and only three bedrooms, my parents had a simple system for deciding who slept where. The smallest bedroom was what we called the box room. It was narrow and did not have much space beyond a bed and a few belongings. The youngest child in the family would sleep there until the next sibling was born. Then, once they were old enough, they would move into one of the larger shared bedrooms, and the new youngest child would eventually take the box room. There was an age gap of around 4 years between each of us, so every child spent roughly the same period in that bedroom. We were usually 3 or 4 years old when we moved out. At the time, none of us questioned the arrangement. It was simply how the house worked. A new baby arrived, the older children moved around, and the box room became the youngest child's bedroom again. Looking back, however, it is strange that every one of us spent our earliest years alone in the same room. It is even stranger when I think about the things we apparently experienced there. The story I remember most clearly happened when my younger sister was around 3 years old. I would have been 7 or 8 at the time. It was morning, and my mother was going through the house waking everyone up. She did what mothers usually do on school mornings. She moved from bedroom to bedroom, opened curtains, switched on lights, and told us to get out of bed. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual until she reached my sister's room. My sister was awake, but she did not respond normally. She was sitting or lying in bed with her eyes fixed on one corner of the bedroom. She was completely focused on it. My mother spoke to her, but my sister did not answer. At first, Mum probably assumed she was still half asleep. Young children sometimes wake slowly. They can stare without speaking for a few moments while they come out of a dream. But my sister did not blink or look toward her. She kept staring at the corner. My mother asked whether she was all right. There was still no reply. She moved closer and asked what she was looking at. My sister finally answered, the man with the hat. She said it calmly, as though someone was clearly standing there. My mother looked toward the corner. There was no man, there was no coat stand, large toy, or piece of furniture that should have looked like one. The corner was empty, but my sister continued staring at the same place. She did not appear to be pretending. She was not smiling or trying to frighten anyone. She seemed to be in some kind of trance, unable or unwilling to look away from whatever she believed was there. My mother became frightened. She went to get my father as quickly as she could. Dad was a very practical, no-nonsense person. He was not interested in ghosts or dramatic explanations. If one of us claimed to see something, he would usually assume it was a dream, shadow, or childish imagination. He entered the room and woke my sister properly. I do not know exactly what he did. He may have spoken loudly, touched her shoulder, or lifted her from the bed. Whatever happened, she seemed to come out of the strange state. The man in the hat was gone. My sister stopped staring at the corner and behaved normally again. At the time, the family did not treat it as proof that something paranormal was in the room. She was 3 years old. She could have been dreaming with her eyes open. Children often wake from vivid dreams and continue seeing parts of them in the real room. A shadow in the corner could have looked like a man. Something hanging nearby might have resembled a hat. Once she became fully awake, the image disappeared. That would have been a reasonable explanation. The story remained in the family, but for years I did not understand how many other experiences had happened in that same bedroom. Much later, when we were older, the subject came up again. Someone mentioned the morning when my sister stared into the corner and spoke about the man with the hat. At first, it was treated like an old family story. Then, my mother began listing other things that had happened in the box room. She had apparently kept much of it to herself while we were children. One by one, she described experiences reported by all of us during the years we slept there. Several of us had complained about being dragged down the bed during the night. We would go to sleep with our heads on the pillow, then wake, feeling as though something had taken hold of us and pulled us toward the bottom. My mother sometimes entered the bedroom and found us halfway down the mattress. On other occasions, she found us standing beside the bed. We were small children, so it was easy to assume we had moved in our sleep. Children twist around, kick off blankets, slide down mattresses, and sometimes sleepwalk. A restless 3-year-old can end up in almost any position by morning. But according to my mother, the way we described it was often the same. We did not simply say we woke at the bottom of the bed. We said something had dragged us. That wording disturbed her, especially because different children used the same room years apart. One child might invent a frightening explanation after waking in an unusual position. Several children repeating a similar experience made it harder to ignore. There were other incidents, too. My mother said she sometimes came into the room and found one of us standing when we should have been asleep. We might be beside the bed, facing part of the room, or apparently unaware of what we were doing. Sometimes we responded slowly when she spoke. Other times we seemed fully asleep despite being upright. Sleepwalking can explain that. It is common in children and may run in families. A child can sit up, walk across a room, speak or stare while remaining partly asleep. They may not remember anything the following morning. The strange state my sister was in could also have been a sleepwalking episode. She may have opened her eyes while still dreaming and projected the image of a man into the corner. That explanation would account for the fixed stare and her lack of response. But then, my mother revealed something else. My older brother had spoken about the man with the hat, too. He had slept in the box room years before my younger sister. He had also been around the same age when he described the figure. This was not a story my sister had heard from him as far as we knew. The family had not spent years discussing a hat-wearing ghost in front of the younger children. My brother had moved out of the room before she was old enough to understand much of what he said. Yet both of them described a man wearing a hat. That was the detail that changed the story for me. A shadowy man is a common image. A hat makes the figure more specific. Maybe there was something in the room that naturally formed that shape. Perhaps furniture, hanging clothes, and light from the hallway created the outline of a tall person with a hat. If the room remained arranged similarly for years, different children could see the same illusion. The corner may have contained a wardrobe, shelf, or hook where clothing was hung. At night, a coat with something placed above it could resemble a head and hat. Young children waking from dreams might interpret the shape in the same way. That would be the simplest explanation. But my sister had been staring at an apparently empty corner in the morning. The room should have been lighter by then. My mother was close enough to look at the same area and saw nothing that resembled a person. Maybe the curtains were still closed and the corner remained dark. Perhaps the object creating the shape had been moved by the time the story was retold. I do not know. The box room was small, and memory has changed its exact layout. There may have been far more ordinary visual confusion than any of us now remember. Still, learning that my brother had seen the same figure at a similar age deeply unsettled me. It suggested a pattern. Each child entered the room when they were very young. They slept there for several years. Some complained of being pulled down the bed. Some were found standing at night. At least 2 described a man wearing a hat. Then, once they moved to another bedroom, the experiences seemed to stop. I do not remember anyone seeing the man elsewhere in the house. He belonged to the box room. The age pattern is important, too. 3- and 4-year-old children have active imaginations and little ability to separate dreams from waking experiences. They are also more likely to experience night terrors, sleepwalking, and confused awakenings. The repeated age may have had nothing to do with the room itself. Every child who slept there happened to be at the age when unusual sleep behavior is common. When we moved into larger rooms, we were older, and the episodes naturally decreased. That explanation fits very well. The family system placed each child in the box room during the exact stage of life when nightmares and sleep disturbances were most likely. Different children may have had similar experiences because they shared genetics, routines, and environment. If one sibling was prone to sleepwalking, the others might be too. The feeling of being dragged could come from sliding down the mattress during restless sleep. A child waking halfway down the bed might create an explanation for the movement. They did not remember kicking or shifting, so they imagined that someone pulled them. The man with the hat could be a common sleep hallucination. People often report seeing shadowy human figures when waking or falling asleep. These figures sometimes stand in corners or near doorways. They may appear to wear hats because the upper part of the shadow spreads outward. A half-dreaming child might see the same basic shape without any supernatural cause. The figure known as the Hat Man appears in many modern stories about sleep paralysis. But there is no need to assume my siblings knew those stories. The human brain may simply create similar threatening shapes. A tall, dark person wearing a hat is easy to form from low light. The hat gives the figure an old-fashioned or unfamiliar appearance, which makes it more memorable. Sleep paralysis itself would be less likely in a child standing or sitting freely. But related hallucinations can happen without full paralysis. My sister may have been awake enough to speak, but still partly inside a dream. My brother may have experienced the same kind of episode years earlier. That is the rational explanation I return to. But there are details that still bother me. The children were not only reporting dreams. My mother claimed to find us physically moved. We were halfway down the bed. We were standing in the room. Something seemed to affect the body as well as the imagination. Again, children move in their sleep. That is not unusual. But from a frightened child's perspective, waking in another position can feel as though an outside force acted on them. The memory of being pulled may be created during the moment of waking. A sudden muscle movement, slipping blanket, or sensation of falling could become the feeling of hands dragging the legs. The mind supplies an attacker because it cannot remember its own movement. Several siblings could describe it similarly because the sensation itself is similar. There may also have been a problem with the bed. The mattress could have sloped downward. The frame may have been uneven. A small child sleeping on a smooth sheet might slowly slide toward the foot during the night. If the same bed remained in the box room for each child, all of us could end up halfway down it. That would create a perfect physical explanation for the repeated position. The family may have blamed something mysterious instead of checking the frame. I do not know whether the bed changed between siblings. If it remained the same, a slope is very possible. Standing beside the bed could result from sleepwalking after sliding or waking confused. The room may also have been too warm, too cold, poorly ventilated, or noisy. Environmental conditions can disturb sleep. An old house can produce low noises through pipes and walls. Light from passing vehicles may move across a corner and form shapes. A cramped room can make a child feel trapped. All of those things could contribute to recurring fear. None of that fully explains why my mother continued placing each new youngest child in the room after unusual incidents began. When she told us everything, years later, that was one of my first thoughts. Why did she keep sending us in there? If she believed the room was haunted, why allow another 3-year-old to sleep alone in it? Part of me still finds that baffling. But looking at it from her position, the answer may be simple. There were 4 children and only 3 bedrooms. The box room was the only available space for the youngest child. Most of the incidents had reasonable explanations. A child slid down the bed. Another sleepwalked. Someone described a shadow after waking. Parents cannot rearrange an entire household every time a young child reports a frightening dream. My mother may have been uneasy, but she also had practical responsibilities. She probably told herself the same things I tell myself now. Children imagine things. Old houses make noises. The bed causes them to slide. They will grow out of it. And apparently, we did. No one was physically injured. No child disappeared. The man with the hat did not attack anyone while awake. The experiences stopped when we got older or changed rooms. That would encourage a parent to treat the incidents as a stage rather than a danger. She may also have avoided discussing them because she did not want to frighten us. If she told each new child that the room had a man in the corner, we would almost certainly see him. Silence may have been her attempt to prevent suggestion. That makes the independent descriptions more meaningful, but it also explains why she never moved us immediately. My father's attitude probably influenced the decision too. He was practical and did not accept supernatural explanations. When my sister stared into the corner, Mum called him because she was scared. He woke the child, saw no man, and likely treated the event as a dream. If he believed the room was safe, changing the sleeping arrangements would seem unnecessary. My mother may have doubted her own instincts. When something strange happens in a family, people often look to the most confident person for an explanation. If Dad said there was nothing there, she may have tried to accept that. Years later, with all the children grown, she finally felt able to admit how many incidents had worried her. I sometimes wonder whether she kept even more stories from us. The phrase all sorts suggests there were smaller events nobody recorded carefully. Maybe blankets were pulled away. Maybe toys moved. Perhaps children cried without knowing why, or refused to face a certain corner. Those details may have blurred together over time. Without dates, written accounts, or independent descriptions, it is difficult to know which incidents were truly separate. Family stories combine. One child's experience can slowly become something that happened to several. My mother may remember entering the room and finding different children standing, when it actually happened only once or twice. My brother's man with a hat might have been discussed more openly than anyone recalls, allowing my sister to absorb the image. A 3-year-old can remember a phrase heard months earlier, even when adults assume they were not listening. These possibilities matter. Memory is powerful, but unreliable, especially across decades. The most honest version is that my mother believed several children had unusual experiences in the same room, and at least 2 were remembered as describing a man in a hat. That is enough to be unsettling without claiming perfect proof. I have tried to picture the figure from my sister's perspective. She wakes in the box room. The morning light is weak. Someone is standing in the corner. He is tall compared with a 3-year-old. His face may be hidden. The hat creates a clear outline above his head. He does not speak or move. He only watches. My mother enters and asks questions, but my sister cannot look away. To her, the man is more real than the person beside the bed. Then Dad arrives, wakes her fully, and the corner becomes empty. That could be a dream crossing into waking life. It could also be something none of us understand. The fact that the man did not seem violent should be comforting, but it is not. He stood in a child's bedroom. He appeared to more than one child. If the dragging experiences were connected to him, then his presence may not have been passive. Maybe he pulled us toward the bottom of the bed. Maybe he caused us to stand. That interpretation turns several ordinary sleep behaviors into the actions of one figure. There is no evidence tying them together, but the idea is difficult to avoid once the pattern is known. I have wondered whether the room had a history before our family lived there. Was it always a bedroom? Did someone die there? Did a previous resident wear a distinctive hat? We never found a story connecting the house to a particular man. The building may not have been especially old or historically significant. Not every strange room needs a tragic past. The figure could come from the children, not the house. Perhaps we inherited similar sleep patterns and similar fears. Because we shared parents, age gaps, and the same small room, our experiences naturally repeated. That is probably more likely than a dead stranger returning for each youngest child. Still, the room seems to have had its own role in the family. Every few years, a new child entered it. The previous child moved out and became older. The youngest took their place. The same corner remained. The same bed or furniture may have stayed. Then, another child began waking in strange positions or staring at someone no adult could see. It almost feels as though the room waited for each new occupant to reach the right age. I do not know what happened to the house after we left, or whether another family's child slept in that room. Part of me wonders whether they ever reported the same things. Perhaps a new parent walked in one morning and found their child staring into the corner. Maybe the child spoke about a man wearing a hat. Or perhaps nothing ever happened again because the experiences belonged entirely to our family. No one followed us to another house. As far as I know, my siblings stopped seeing the figure after moving out of the box room. That supports an environmental explanation. Whatever caused it was connected to the layout, light, bed, or atmosphere of that particular bedroom. If it had been attached to one child, it should have followed them. It did not. The same is true if the room influenced our sleep. Moving into a different bedroom changed the sounds, lighting, and sleeping arrangements. The episodes stopped naturally. That is reassuring. Even so, the story still spooks me. It is not only because my sister saw a man. Children see things. It is the repetition. My older brother spoke about the man with the hat at a similar age. Several siblings complained of being dragged down the bed. My mother found us standing or positioned strangely. She knew enough to become frightened when my sister stared into the corner, yet the full pattern was not revealed until years later. I also cannot forget how quickly she went to get my father. Her reaction suggests she already feared the room before that morning. Maybe my sister's words confirmed something Mum had been trying not to believe. She did not calmly tell the child it was a dream. She left and brought Dad immediately. The memory may exaggerate the speed, but the fear was real. I sometimes feel angry that she continued using the room. Then I remember that parents make decisions with the information and resources available to them. She may not have believed the incidents were supernatural. She may have thought moving us would reinforce the fear. She had a crowded house and a system that worked. The children grew up. No one was harmed. From her perspective, keeping the room in use may have seemed completely reasonable. But I still would not have wanted to sleep there once I knew the full story. Even now, I imagine waking in that small room as a 3-year-old. The door is closed. The house is quiet. Something pulls the blankets, and my body shifts toward the foot of the mattress. I wake standing beside the bed without remembering how I got there. Then, on another morning, I open my eyes and see the same person my brother saw years earlier. A man in the corner, a hat hiding the shape of his head. He does not need to speak. He only waits for the next child to notice him. Maybe every part of the story can be explained by sleepwalking, a sloped mattress, family memory, and shadows. I hope that is all it was. But 2 children, separated by years, described the same figure when they were nearly the same age. And when my sister stared into that empty corner, she did not ask whether someone was there. She already knew what she was looking at. The man with the hat. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. Right after I graduated, I traveled to Kansas to visit a friend of mine. Her father was away on a work trip, so for the duration of my visit, we had the house mostly to ourselves. My friend's girlfriend was staying there too, and at first the whole trip felt relaxed. We were young, recently out of school, and happy to have a large house without parents around. We stayed up late, slept at strange hours, ate whenever we wanted, and spent most of the time talking or doing nothing important. My friend had never warned me that there was anything unusual about the property. She never called it haunted. She did not tell me frightening stories about previous owners or avoid certain rooms. As far as I could tell, she and her father treated it like a normal home. It was an older house, but not in a way that immediately made me uncomfortable. The rooms were large, and parts of it felt quieter than the modern homes I was used to, but nothing about it seemed threatening. One afternoon, my friend and her girlfriend went downstairs to sleep. I was not tired. I had already looked around for something to do, but there was not much happening. Eventually, I decided to use the computer in her father's study. The study was separate from the rooms where my friend and her girlfriend were sleeping. It felt private, like the kind of room children and guests normally entered only with permission. Because her father was away, I convinced myself that using the computer for a little while would not matter. I went inside and sat down at the desk. The room was quiet. I started playing online, probably browsing websites or using whatever games and chat rooms were available at the time. I do not remember exactly what I was doing because the ordinary part of the memory disappeared beneath what happened next. Only a few minutes passed before I heard a voice. It was muffled and low. At first, I thought it came from the computer speakers. Maybe a website had started playing an advertisement or some audio was running in the background. I checked the screen. Nothing obvious was playing. Then I heard another voice answer. Both sounded like adult men. I could not understand what either of them was saying. The words were blurred, as if the conversation were happening through a wall or from another room at the far end of the house. My first thought was that someone had come home. Maybe my friend's father had returned from his trip early. Perhaps a neighbor or relative had entered with a key. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The house had been silent before. My friend and her girlfriend were asleep downstairs, and as far as I knew, no one else was supposed to be there. The voices continued. One man spoke. The other responded. Their tones were not calm. Even without understanding the words, I could tell they were arguing. One voice would rise sharply, and the other would answer with the same anger. The sound had the rhythm of a real disagreement, with one person interrupting and the other pushing back. I sat completely still. I tried to decide where the voices were coming from. They did not sound like a television. There was no music, background noise, or artificial quality. They sounded like two people standing somewhere inside the house. For a moment, I considered going downstairs and waking my friend. But I would have to leave the study and move toward the voices. I hoped they would stop. Instead, they became louder. The change did not sound as though someone had turned up the volume on a television or radio. The voices grew clearer because they were coming closer. I could hear the difference in distance. At first, they had sounded as though they were several rooms away. Then they seemed to enter the hallway. The words remained impossible to understand, but the men no longer sounded far off. They were approaching the study. Fear came over me immediately. It was not the slow nervousness of hearing an unfamiliar noise. My body reacted as though I already knew there was something wrong. I stood from the computer and moved toward the door. The study door was partially open. I thought about pulling it closed and locking it, but I did not know whether it had a lock. Closing it might also make noise and reveal that someone was inside. I stayed close to the doorway, listening. The argument continued. One voice sounded deeper. The other was slightly different, but I could not remember enough to describe it accurately. Neither voice belonged to my friend or her girlfriend. They were clearly adult male voices. The conversation moved closer. I expected to hear footsteps, but I do not remember any. That was one of the details that disturbed me afterward. The voices traveled through the house, but I could not hear shoes on the floor, doors opening, or bodies brushing against walls. There was only the argument. The closer they came, the more certain I became that two men were walking toward the study. I was now beside the partially open door. Through the gap, I could see part of the hallway. It was empty. The voices sounded as if they were just beyond my view. One man spoke angrily. The other replied. Then they seemed to arrive directly outside the room. They stopped at the door. I could hear them on the other side. I still could not make out a single complete word. The sounds had all the shape and emotion of speech, but no meaning. It was like listening to people argue underwater or through several thick blankets. I knew they were close enough that I should have understood them. That made the experience feel impossible. If two men were standing immediately outside a partially open door, their words should have been clear. I should also have been able to see part of a body through the gap. A shoulder, a shadow, a shoe. Anything, there was nothing. I froze. I could not pull the door open. I could not step backward. I stood beside it while the two voices continued just outside. The fear was so strong that time seemed to slow down. It felt as though I remained there for hours, listening to the argument without moving. In reality, it was probably only a few minutes. My body felt heavy and useless. I remember thinking that if I opened the door, I would see whoever was speaking. I also thought that whatever waited outside might enter if it realized I was there. The voices did not call my name. They did not speak directly to me. They seemed focused on each other. But their movement through the house had brought them straight to the study, as though the argument belonged there. I waited for one of them to push the door open. The gap remained the same. No hand appeared around the edge. The door did not move. Eventually, something in me broke through the fear. I knew I could not remain trapped in that room. The front entrance was not far away. If I moved quickly enough, I could reach it and get outside before anyone stopped me. I grabbed the door and pulled it fully open. The hallway was empty. There were no men standing there. I did not stop to search. I ran. I sprinted through the house toward the front door, opened it, and rushed outside. I expected someone to follow me. I thought I might hear the argument behind me or footsteps running through the hall. Nothing came. I shut the door and moved onto the porch. The afternoon outside looked completely normal. There were no unfamiliar vehicles parked near the house. No men walked away from the property. No one stood near a window. The difference between the fear inside and the ordinary world outside was almost disorienting. I sat on the porch. I did not go back inside. My friend and her girlfriend were still sleeping downstairs, but I could not make myself return to wake them. That may sound strange. If I believed intruders were inside, I should have warned them immediately. But the voices had not sounded human by the time they reached the study door. The hallway had been empty. I did not know what I would be returning to. I stayed outside for what may have been close to an hour. I watched the door and waited for someone to emerge. No one did. Eventually, my friend woke and realized I was missing. She came outside and found me sitting on the porch. She asked what I was doing there. I told her what had happened. I explained that I had heard two men arguing inside the house. I said the voices had started at a distance, moved closer, and stopped outside her father's study. I told her that when I opened the door, no one was there. She listened. Then she told me something she had never mentioned before. Her father had only been able to afford the property because a double murder had happened there decades earlier. According to her, the house had struggled to keep an owner after that. People bought it and did not remain for long. The history had lowered the value enough for her father to purchase it. She said neither she nor her father had ever seen or felt anything unusual. They had not heard voices. They did not consider the house actively haunted, but she offered the old murders as a possible reason for what I experienced. In one sense, I appreciated that she believed me enough to give me an explanation. In another, I wished she had never told me. Until that moment, I could still think of the voices as a television, an open internet page, a neighbor, or some strange effect of sound traveling through the building. Once I knew that two people had been murdered there, the argument felt connected to the house's history. I immediately imagined that I had heard the final moments before the killings. Two men shouting, the confrontation moving through the rooms, the voices reaching the study. I do not know whether that interpretation matches the real event. My friend did not tell me who the victims were, where in the house they died, or what had happened before the murders. I never learned whether the victims were men. I do not know if an argument was involved at all. The voices may have had nothing to do with the history. The connection exists mainly because I learned about the murders immediately after hearing something unexplained. That timing made it difficult not to link them. There are several ordinary explanations for what happened. The first is that the sound came from the computer. I had been online. A website, game, advertisement, or chat application may have been playing audio without my noticing. Speakers can make voices sound distant when the volume is low or when sound is coming through poor quality recordings. As I moved toward the door, the acoustics of the study may have changed, making the voices seem louder and closer. The argument might have been part of a video or radio stream. When I opened the door and ran, I may have moved too quickly to realize the sound remained in the room, but I remember checking the computer when the voices began. Nothing appeared to be playing. The voices also seemed to move through the house, not remain near the desk. Sound direction can be difficult to judge indoors, especially when walls and hallways create echoes. A speaker behind me could reflect sound from the hallway and make it seem external. The louder volume may have come from the recording itself rather than movement. People arguing often raise their voices gradually. What I interpreted as approaching distance could have been increasing intensity. That is possible. Another explanation is that a television or radio was on downstairs. My friend or her girlfriend may have left something playing before falling asleep. Sound could travel through vents, walls, or stairways. A program containing two men arguing might seem to move as different frequencies reached the study. The house was unfamiliar to me, so I did not understand how sound traveled through it. A conversation from another floor might appear to come from the hallway. When I later asked my friend, she may not have checked whether a television had been on. The voices could also have come from outside. Neighbors arguing near an open window could sound as if they were inside. Two men walking along the side of the house would naturally grow louder as they approached the study and then fade as they moved past. If the windows were closed, their words would be muffled. The walls could remove enough clarity that only tone remained. When they reached the area outside the study, I might interpret them as standing at the door. By the time I opened it, they may have moved beyond the house. I did not check the side yard or back of the property when I ran outside. I only looked generally for people. This explanation fits the movement and muffled speech well, but I do not remember the voices fading away after passing. They seemed to stop directly outside the study. There were no footsteps on gravel or sounds from outdoors. I also felt the voices were inside the hallway, though feelings about sound location can be wrong. The house may have shared vents or old heating ducts that carried voices from another room or even another part of the property. Large, older houses often have strange acoustic paths. A conversation in the basement can emerge from a vent upstairs. Someone outside near a chimney or open duct can sound as though they are behind a wall. If workers, neighbors, or people on the street were talking, the structure might funnel their voices toward the study. The lack of understandable words could result from frequencies being filtered by the walls. Only the lower tones and emotional rhythm would travel clearly. This is a strong physical explanation. My fear may have made the sound seem closer and more deliberate than it was. There is also a chance that my friend and her girlfriend were awake and talking downstairs. Their voices might sound deeper and unfamiliar through the house. But I heard 2 men, not 2 women. They both appeared to be asleep when my friend later found me. They could have awakened briefly, spoken, and fallen asleep again without remembering, although the angry argument would be unusual. One of them might have played a prank, but neither admitted it. They would also need to imitate 2 male voices and move the sound toward the study without being seen. That seems unlikely. An intruder remains another possibility. 2 men could have entered through an unlocked door or window and argued while moving through the house. When they reached the study, they may have heard me move. Perhaps they went silent and hid when I opened the door. I ran so quickly that I did not search the nearby rooms. They could have remained inside while I sat on the porch. That idea is frightening because my friend and her girlfriend were asleep downstairs. However, nothing was stolen. No doors or windows appeared forced. No one came out during the hour I waited. My friend moved through the house and found no strangers. If 2 intruders had been present, they somehow disappeared without any later evidence. It is possible, but not the most likely explanation. The experience may also have been connected to exhaustion or the strange schedule of the visit. I had recently graduated and may have been sleeping poorly. The house was quiet, and I was alone in an unfamiliar room. Under those conditions, the brain can misinterpret sounds or produce vivid auditory experiences. People sometimes hear voices when falling asleep or waking, but I believed I was fully awake and using the computer. Extreme tiredness can still cause brief hallucinations even during apparently normal activity. The voices may have come from my own mind. That would explain why they contained emotion without understandable language. The brain can create the sound of conversation without forming actual words. It would also explain how the voices seemed to move despite the empty hallway. But I had never experienced anything similar before. I was not ill, intoxicated, or aware of being especially sleep-deprived. The fear began only after I heard the voices, rather than creating them beforehand. Still, one isolated auditory hallucination is possible, and does not necessarily indicate anything serious. The most disturbing interpretation is that the house somehow repeated an old argument. Some people believe traumatic events leave impressions in locations. They describe these experiences as residual hauntings rather than conscious spirits. A voice, footstep, or scene repeats under certain conditions, almost like a recording. The people involved do not react to witnesses because they are not truly present. They simply follow the same path again. What I heard seemed to fit that idea. The voices argued with each other and ignored me. They moved through the house toward the study. Even when they reached the door, they did not speak to me or enter. They continued a conversation I could not understand. Then, when I finally opened the door, there was nothing there. If the argument was a replay of something connected to the murders, it may explain why the words never became clear. I was hearing only an impression of anger and movement rather than an actual conversation. There is no scientific evidence that houses store events in that way. The theory is useful mainly because it gives a shape to experiences that otherwise make no sense. It also depends on assuming the murders involved an argument and occurred near the study. Facts I never confirmed. Without those details, the haunting explanation remains a story built around coincidence. My friend's information may have influenced the memory afterward. Before she told me, I heard unexplained male voices. After she mentioned a double murder, the voices became part of the house's tragic past. Each time I retold the story, the connection may have grown stronger. Perhaps the voices were less clearly male than I remember. Maybe they were not as close to the door. Fear and later knowledge can sharpen uncertain details. I try to remain honest about that. What I remember most clearly is the tone. The voices were angry. They responded to each other. Their volume increased as though the speakers approached. I stood beside the partially open study door and believed two people were immediately outside. The hallway was empty when I finally opened it. Those are the core details. I never entered the study again during the rest of my visit. Even in daylight, I avoided it. The computer no longer seemed worth using. The room felt occupied by the memory of the voices. If I passed the doorway, I expected to hear the argument begin again. Nothing else happened while I remained at the house. I did not hear footsteps, see figures, or wake to anyone standing nearby. My friend and her girlfriend continued sleeping and living there without concern. Their normal behavior made me question myself. If the house had a long history of paranormal activity, why had the residents never experienced anything? Why would it happen only to a guest? Maybe I was simply in the right room at the right time to hear an ordinary source. Perhaps the computer, vents, or outside acoustics produced something my friend had never noticed because she did not sit there alone in silence. Or maybe unfamiliar people are more alert to a house's sounds. Residents learn to ignore noises that visitors immediately notice. My friend's father may have heard the voices and chosen not to mention them. He could have known that discussing the murders would frighten his daughter or make the property harder to sell later. There is no evidence for that, but adults often keep uncomfortable histories from younger family members. My friend already knew about the double murder, so the subject was not completely hidden. She may simply have believed nothing unusual remained. When the visit ended, I took a Greyhound bus home. I never returned to that house. Part of that was ordinary distance. Kansas was not somewhere I could visit casually, and life moved on after graduation. But I had no desire to stay in the property again. I especially did not want to be alone near the study. For years, I thought about the fact that the voices stopped at the door. If they had continued past the room, I might accept that they belonged to people outside or sound traveling through the house. If they had faded, I could imagine a car radio or television. Instead, they seemed to arrive exactly where I was. I sometimes wonder whether they were not approaching the study at all. Maybe I was hearing them from inside it. The computer, walls, or something beneath the floor could have been the source from the beginning. As I became frightened and moved toward the door, my perception placed them outside because I expected danger to enter. The sound may never have changed location. My body may have created the sense of approach. Fear affects hearing. When someone feels threatened, distant sounds seem closer. The brain becomes focused on the possibility of immediate danger and interprets uncertainty in the most protective way. That could explain why I froze. There may never have been anything outside the door. My nervous system reacted before I confirmed the source. Still, I remember the movement distinctly. The voices began muffled and far away. They grew louder in a way that felt connected to distance. By the time I reached the door, they were on the other side. That memory has not changed. I also remember how impossible the speech sounded. The men were close, but the words remained blurred. If it was an ordinary conversation, I should have understood at least a phrase. An insult, a name, a command. Instead, I heard only the emotional shape of language. One person accused, the other resisted. Both became angrier. The absence of words made the argument feel older than normal speech, like sounds stripped of meaning. That may be why I believe the voices were not human, even before learning the house's history. They behaved like people, but did not communicate like people. I am grateful my friend found me on the porch. If she had slept for several more hours, I might have remained outside until dark. I was too frightened to return for my belongings alone. Once she came outside, the house became less threatening because I no longer had to enter by myself. She did not mock me. She listened and offered the only history she knew. At the time, that felt comforting. At least there was a reason. Later, I realized that a reason is not the same as an explanation. A double murder in a house does not prove every strange sound is paranormal. It may increase the chance that people interpret ordinary events as haunting. If she had told me the house had once been a music school, I might decide the voices came from old recordings. If she said a radio enthusiast had lived there, I might blame hidden equipment. The history guided my interpretation because murder is emotionally powerful. I never researched the case. I did not look for newspaper reports or property records. Part of me did not want to learn more. If the murders involved two men arguing near the study, I would have felt certain I heard a replay. If the victims were entirely different, the connection might collapse. Either answer could make the memory harder to live with. So I left it alone. I prefer to admit that I do not know. Maybe audio played through the computer. Maybe voices traveled through vents or from outside. Maybe I experienced a brief auditory hallucination caused by tiredness and isolation. Maybe two intruders entered and left unseen. Or maybe the house held on to the sound of an argument that ended violently decades before I arrived. There is no evidence strong enough to choose between them. What happened lasted only a few minutes. Nothing touched me. No figure appeared. The voices did not speak my name. But the lack of a visible source made the experience more frightening than seeing two real men would have been. Real people could be avoided, confronted, or reported. These voices came closer without bodies. They stopped outside a door without casting shadows. They argued without producing a single understandable word. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I still remember the moment before I ran. My hand was near the partially open door. The two voices were just beyond it, rising and falling in anger. I knew that pulling it open would reveal something. Instead, it revealed nothing. That empty hallway frightened me enough to leave the house and sit outside alone for an hour. I never entered the study again. When my visit ended, I boarded the Greyhound and went home. I never returned to the property. The last thing my friend gave me was an explanation I could neither prove nor forget. Two people had been murdered in that house decades earlier. Owners rarely stayed, and while everyone else slept downstairs, I had listened to two men argue their way through the empty rooms until their voices reached the study door and stopped. When I was around 5 or 6 years old, I had what my family considered an uncanny ability to predict thunderstorms. No one ever figured out how I did it. The storms were especially bad that year. We lived on a hill, so lightning felt close whenever it came through. The sky would flash so brightly that the whole house lit up, and thunder seemed to roll directly over the roof. These were not gentle summer showers. They were violent storms with sudden wind, heavy rain, and enough lightning that my mother worried about electrical equipment inside the house. Before each storm, I claimed that 3 dogs came to warn me. I called them the lightning dogs. They were always together. They looked roughly like black Labradors, but only in their general size and body shape. Everything else about them seemed wrong. Their ears were extremely pointed. Their tails were long and sharp-looking. Their fur did not lie flat like the coat of a normal dog. It stuck out in jagged spikes, as though someone had drawn them in the style of a horror comic rather than creating real animals. The closest comparison I can make is that they looked like dogs made from black thorns. Their eyes glowed orange, not yellow or brown like ordinary animal eyes reflecting light. They looked almost neon, like embers burning inside their heads. Despite their appearance, I was never afraid of them. That may be the strangest part. If I saw the same animals now, I would probably run. 3 black dogs with unnatural fur and glowing eyes should have terrified a small child. Instead, I felt calm when they appeared. I understood that they had come to warn me. They never attacked. They never growled. They did not chase me or show their teeth. They simply appeared, and somehow I knew a storm was coming. I do not remember the dogs speaking in words. The warning felt more like knowledge arriving with them. I would see the 3 dark shapes and immediately understand that lightning was on the way. As soon as I saw them, I began running through the house, unplugging things. I pulled cords from the walls wherever I could reach them. I disconnected lamps, televisions, and small appliances because I believed the storm was close and wanted to protect everything. Sometimes the sky outside was still completely blue. There were no dark clouds above the house. The trees were not moving. The air did not look different. To everyone else, there was no reason to expect bad weather. My mother would find me going from room to room and ask what I was doing. I saw the lightning dogs, I would tell her. There's going to be a storm. At first, she probably treated it as a child's imagination. Children create invisible friends and strange explanations for things they do not understand. A 5-year-old talking about glowing dogs sounds like fantasy. But within an hour, a storm would arrive. Clouds would move in. The light outside would change. Thunder would begin in the distance, and soon the sky would break open. This did not happen only once. It happened often enough that my family noticed the pattern. I would see the dogs. I would warn my mother. Then the storm would come. Sometimes the first signs appeared quickly. Other times nearly an hour passed before the weather changed. But according to my family, I was rarely, if ever, wrong. The lightning dogs became part of our household language. If I started unplugging things, my mother understood what it meant. She might still look outside at the clear sky and wonder how I could possibly know, but she no longer dismissed me completely. The storms proved me right too many times. One day, the same thing happened while I was at school. I was still very young, probably in kindergarten. The classroom was full of ordinary equipment, and the day seemed normal. The teacher was speaking or leading an activity when I suddenly became convinced that a storm was coming. I had seen the lightning dogs. I stood up and began moving around the classroom, unplugging things. I did not ask permission. To me, this was an emergency. The dogs had warned me, which meant the adults needed to prepare. The teacher stopped me and asked what I was doing. I explained that there was going to be a storm because I had seen the lightning dogs. She was understandably confused. The weather outside did not support what I was saying. I was a small child moving around the classroom, disconnecting equipment, because of three animals no one else could see. She probably thought I was acting out a game or repeating something from a dream. Then the storm arrived. According to the way my family remembers it, the weather changed quickly and violently. Thunder began. Rain hit the building. Lightning flashed outside. The teacher was shocked enough that she called my mother. She asked whether I had done anything like that before. My mother's answer was basically that I did it all the time. She could not explain it. She only knew that I was never wrong. After that, the story spread among some of my mother's friends. People began calling her before making outdoor plans. They would ask whether I had seen the dogs yet. It became a kind of family joke. If they wanted to have a picnic, work in the garden, or spend the day outside, they wanted to know whether the strange little weather forecaster had received a warning. They did not necessarily believe that supernatural dogs were visiting me. But they trusted the result. If I had seen them, they expected rain. If I had not, they felt safer making plans. I imagine the adults laughed about it, but there must also have been some genuine uncertainty. A child could accidentally predict one storm. Even two correct guesses could be coincidence. But repeated warnings under clear skies, followed by violent weather within an hour, would become difficult to ignore. There are ordinary explanations for what happened. The most likely is that I noticed environmental changes before the adults did. Children sometimes pay attention to details that adults have learned to ignore. I may have sensed changes in air pressure. Before a storm, the pressure often drops. Some people experience headaches, ear pressure, joint pain, or other physical sensations. At 5 or 6 years old, I would not have known how to describe that feeling. Instead of saying the air pressure had changed, my mind may have created an image that represented the warning. The lightning dogs could have been the form my brain gave to a real physical sensation. Maybe my ears felt different. Maybe the air smelled unusual. Storms can produce changes in temperature, humidity, wind, and scent before clouds are obvious overhead. The smell people associate with rain can sometimes be noticed before the first drops fall. Ozone from electrical activity may also create a sharp smell around thunderstorms. Perhaps I detected one of these changes without understanding it. A young child might not consciously think, the air smells like a storm. Instead, the sensation could trigger a familiar mental image. Then, I would say the dogs had arrived. There may also have been distant thunder below the level that adults noticed. Children often have sharper hearing than older people. I might have heard low rumbles far beyond the hill or detected electrical buzzing from equipment before lightning became visible. The sound may have been too faint for me to recognize directly. My brain could have interpreted it as the presence of animals. Weather signs might also have appeared in the behavior of real animals. Birds sometimes change their activity before storms. Insects become quieter or more active depending on conditions. Dogs and livestock may behave differently when thunder is approaching. I could have unconsciously noticed these patterns. Perhaps 3 actual black dogs lived nearby or regularly crossed our property when the air changed. If they sought shelter before storms, I might see them at the same time each storm approached. Over time, my memory could have changed their appearance. Ordinary black dogs became spiky. Reflected light became glowing orange eyes. Their repeated arrival made them seem like supernatural messengers. This explanation would fit the number 3 and the dog shape better than a purely internal vision. Maybe there really was a small pack of dogs in the area. They could smell or hear an approaching storm and move towards safer ground. Because our house stood on a hill, their route might pass near us. I saw them before the weather arrived and learned the connection. The adults may not have noticed because they were indoors or busy, but I remember the dogs as appearing in ways that did not feel normal. They were too sharp, too dark and too bright around the eyes. They did not look like animals I could approach and touch. They felt separate from the ordinary world. That description may have come later. Childhood memories are not fixed. Every time a story is told, small details can become stronger. My family repeated the lightning dog story because it was funny and strange. Over the years, I may have remembered the most dramatic version. The dogs may originally have had pointed ears and rough fur, like certain shepherd breeds. A 5-year-old could describe that as spiky. Their eyes may have reflected orange light from a window, street lamp, or sunset. Animal eyes can glow brightly when light hits them at night. What looked supernatural to a child might be ordinary eyeshine. If they appeared during daylight, however, glowing eyes would be harder to explain. I cannot remember every individual sighting clearly enough to know. The events happened many times, and they have blended into one repeated image. 3 black dogs, orange eyes, a warning, then lightning. Another possibility is that I was predicting storms from routine rather than supernatural perception. The storms may have tended to arrive at similar times of day, if that summer had frequent afternoon thunderstorms. I could expect them after certain weather patterns. Maybe I saw clouds far away that adults did not consider important. From the top of a hill, the horizon would be visible over a long distance. A dark line of cloud might be approaching even while the sky, directly above us, remained blue. I could notice the storm before my mother looked carefully. Young children can become very good at recognizing patterns when something interests or frightens them. If I was fascinated by lightning, I may have watched the sky constantly. The adults had work, chores, and conversations occupying their attention. I had time to look. The lightning dogs might have been an imaginative way of expressing an accurate observation. Instead of saying, "I see storm clouds far away," I said the dogs warned me. The adults remembered the dogs because that part was unusual. They may have forgotten the clouds that made the prediction possible. There is also the problem of unsuccessful predictions. My family says I was never wrong, but family memories often preserve correct events and forget mistakes. If I claimed a storm was coming and nothing happened, the adults may have laughed and moved on. When a storm did arrive, everyone remembered. Over time, the failures disappeared from the story. This is called confirmation bias. People naturally notice events that support an unusual pattern. A child predicts 10 storms. 6 arrive. The 6 correct predictions become impressive stories, while the 4 wrong ones are forgotten. By the time the story is repeated years later, the child was never wrong. I cannot prove that did not happen. I was too young to keep records. No one wrote down every time I saw the dogs. The adults' memories are emotional rather than scientific. Still, the school incident seems especially specific. I began unplugging classroom equipment before the storm was obvious. The teacher was confused enough to call my mother afterward. That suggests at least one prediction truly surprised someone outside my family. The teacher had no reason to exaggerate the event. She did not already know the lightning dog story. She saw a child announce a storm under apparently clear conditions. And then the weather changed. One accurate prediction does not require anything paranormal, but it supports the idea that I noticed something real. I have wondered whether I experienced a form of visual aura. Some people see shapes, lights, patterns, or figures before migraines, seizures, or other neurological events. Weather changes can trigger symptoms in sensitive individuals. A drop in barometric pressure might produce a visual disturbance. My young mind could interpret 3 dark shapes with glowing edges as dogs. Then, because the weather caused both the visual event and the storm, The dogs always appeared beforehand. This would create a strong and repeatable connection. The dogs would not need to exist outside my perception. They would be a symptom caused by the same atmospheric change that produced the thunderstorm. I do not remember headaches, nausea, missing time, or other symptoms. I was not afraid or confused after seeing them. The images seemed meaningful and consistent rather than random. Still, neurological experiences do not always cause pain. A child could have unusual visual episodes without knowing they were medical. If the visions stopped as I grew older, that might reflect changes in my nervous system. I do not know whether I continued seeing the dogs after that particular storm season. My strongest memories are from that year. Perhaps the repeated violent weather made me unusually alert, and the pattern faded once the storms became less frequent. The dogs could also have appeared in dreams. Maybe I dreamed about them at night and then announced a storm the following morning. Weather forecasts might have been playing on television where I could hear them without consciously paying attention. Adults often assume children are not listening, but children absorb more than people realize. A meteorologist could mention severe storms approaching. I might not understand the forecast, yet the information entered my dreams as 3 black dogs. When I woke, I believed the dogs had warned me. Later, the storm arrived exactly as the forecast predicted. My family would be amazed, unaware that I had heard the television. This could happen repeatedly if weather reports were common in the house. At school, I might have heard a teacher or radio mention an incoming storm without remembering. The prediction would still feel spontaneous. The brain often hides the source of information while preserving the conclusion. That ordinary explanation is possible, especially during a season known for bad storms. But my family remembers me reacting while the sky was still bright blue and apparently cloudless. The visual contrast became part of the story. A child rushing to unplug everything beneath a clear sky looked ridiculous until thunder arrived. The lightning dogs were not only a way of naming the weather, they were figures I believed I actually saw. I knew their number. I knew their color. I knew the shape of their fur and the glow of their eyes. They were consistent enough that I recognized them immediately. Most childhood imaginary figures change depending on the story. These dogs apparently remained the same. 3 of them. Black, pointed ears and tails. Jagged fur. Orange eyes. They never warned me about anything except storms. They did not appear in my bedroom at night or follow me around during normal days. They had one purpose. They came before lightning. That consistency is what makes them feel less like random imagination. If I invented them, my mind created an extremely reliable internal symbol. Perhaps the first time I saw them was during a storm. Lightning flashed behind 3 real dogs, making their fur look sharp and their eyes glow. The image frightened or fascinated me. Later, whenever I detected storm conditions, my brain replayed the dogs. The warning became attached to the memory. That would explain why I was never afraid. The dogs represented preparation, not danger. They arrived early enough for me to unplug things. They were protectors. In many cultures, black dogs appear in legends as omens, guardians, or signs of death and disaster. I did not know that as a child. I learned about those stories years later. Some traditions describe large black dogs with glowing red or orange eyes appearing before dangerous events. They may be seen near roads, graveyards, storms, or places where someone is about to die. Learning that disturbed me because the descriptions sounded similar to the lightning dogs. A pack of black dogs with glowing eyes was not only my childhood invention. Other people, separated by culture and time, had imagined or reported similar beings. That does not mean I saw the same thing. Black dogs are naturally frightening at night. Their bodies disappear into darkness, while their eyes reflect light. Pointed ears and teeth create an obvious threatening shape. It makes sense that many cultures developed similar legends. Human beings often create the same symbols from the same animals. A dark dog can represent danger, because dogs once protected boundaries and hunted in packs. Glowing eyes are common in real animals under reflected light. The similarity may come from ordinary experience rather than shared paranormal beings. Still, I sometimes wonder whether the dogs were more than a childhood method of reading weather. If they were supernatural, they did not behave like the ominous black dogs from legends. They never seemed evil. They came to help. Our house stood on a hill where lightning storms could be dangerous. They gave me time to unplug electrical equipment and warn adults. Maybe they were guardians connected to the land or weather. Perhaps they appeared because I was young enough to see them without immediately deciding they were impossible. That is a comforting interpretation, but there is no way to prove it. It also raises questions. Why 3 dogs? Why did they choose me? Why did they stop appearing? Could they predict only lightning? Or were they somehow part of it? If they wanted to protect us, why not warn the adults directly? Why appear as frightening animals with ember eyes? There are no answers. The idea of them as storm spirits fits the story emotionally, but not scientifically. The rational explanations remain stronger. Sensitivity to pressure. Distant clouds. Smell, sound, real dogs responding to weather. Subconscious forecasts. Memory selecting correct predictions. A visual aura triggered by atmospheric changes. Any one of these could explain part of what happened. Several working together could explain all of it. I may have been unusually sensitive to storms. My brain translated that sensitivity into an image I could understand. The adults saw only a child describing impossible dogs. Then, the weather confirmed that the warning itself was real. Even if the dogs existed only in my mind, that does not make the ability meaningless. Something told me the storms were coming. My body or senses detected information before I could express it normally. The lightning dogs were the language I used. I wish someone had documented the predictions. My mother could have written down every date and time I saw the dogs, the current weather, and when the storm arrived. With enough records, we could compare the warnings to actual weather reports. Maybe the pattern would disappear under careful examination. Maybe I was right only slightly more often than chance. Or perhaps the record would show something genuinely unusual. A child consistently predicting thunderstorms under clear skies would be worth studying, even without supernatural dogs. No one thought to do that. To my family, it was a strange phase and a useful joke. My mother's friends called to ask about outdoor plans. The teacher told the story after the school storm. Then, I grew older. The terrible storm season ended, and the lightning dogs stopped being part of everyday life. I cannot remember the last time I saw them. Like many childhood experiences, they disappeared without a clear ending. There was no final visit, no last storm where they turned and walked away. At some point, I simply stopped announcing that they had come. Maybe I learned to recognize weather normally and no longer needed the image. Maybe the visions faded as my brain developed. Perhaps I became old enough to tell myself that black dogs with orange eyes could not be real, and once I stopped believing, I stopped seeing them. Or maybe they had completed whatever purpose brought them to me. I still think about how calm I felt around them. The stories I later read described black dogs as omens of death or evil. Mine never felt like that. They looked terrifying, but their message was practical. A storm is coming. Get ready. Unplug the house. warn the adults. They did not cause the lightning. They came before it. I do not remember them entering through a door or walking away afterward. They were simply present long enough for me to know. Then my attention moved to preparing for the storm. It is possible that I never physically saw them in front of me. The word saw may have been the only way a child could explain an internal picture. Sometimes people suddenly imagine something so vividly that it feels almost visible. The dogs may have appeared in my mind rather than in the room. That would make the experience less like an external apparition and more like intuition given a face. I would still honestly tell my mother that I saw them because I did not yet separate mental images from physical sight in an adult way. The distinction matters now, but it may not have mattered at 5. Either way, they felt real. They were real enough to change my behavior. I ran around unplugging appliances. I disrupted a classroom. Adults changed plans based on my warnings. The storms came often enough that people remembered. There was an actual effect in the world, even if the dogs themselves were internal. I do not believe I had magical control over weather. I did not summon storms. I did not know exactly where lightning would strike or how long the rain would last. I only seemed to recognize that one was approaching. Animals do this naturally. Dogs hear thunder before humans. Birds sense pressure changes. Insects alter their behavior. Perhaps children retain some sensitivity adults lose because adults depend more on forecasts and visual signs. Maybe I noticed the same things animals noticed. The shape of dogs may have represented that instinct. That is the explanation I prefer. It respects the accuracy of the warnings without requiring supernatural beings. But it still does not explain why the image was so specific, or why other people later described similar black dogs as omens. Some memories remain suspended between imagination and experience. The lightning dogs are like that for me. I know I was very young. I know children can create vivid figures. I know storms give warnings before they arrive, even under blue skies. I know family stories become more perfect with repetition. All of that could explain what happened. But I also know what my family remembers. Before the clouds appeared, I would begin unplugging everything. My mother would ask why. I would tell her the dogs had come. Within an hour, lightning would be breaking over the hill. At school, I stood up and began protecting the classroom before the teacher saw any reason for concern. She questioned me. I told her about the dogs. Then the storm hit hard enough that she called my mother. My mother could not explain it. She only told her the truth as she understood it. She does that. She's never wrong. Years later, the scientific explanations make sense. Pressure changes. Distant thunder. Subconscious observation. A child's imagination turning weather sensitivity into 3 strange animals. That is probably all it was. But when I remember them, they do not feel like an explanation I invented afterward. They feel like visitors, 3 black dogs standing together. Their bodies shaped like Labradors, but covered in sharp, unnatural fur. Their pointed ears raised. Their tails rigid. Their orange eyes glowing like hot embers. They never frightened me. They only looked at me long enough for me to understand. Then, while the sky was still bright and blue, I would begin pulling plugs from the walls. Because the lightning dogs had come. And the storm was already on its way. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.